There's a photograph in my book of Orson Welles doing magic at the outdoor theater at Camp Anza. So many big names did come and perform for the troops. There's another interesting incident that occurred at that theater, and history seems to show that it was Jimmy Durante, but we're not certain of that. And the incident was that when Jimmy Durante came out to start his act, he noticed that in the front rows, the officers of the camp were seated, and all of the GIs were sitting on the ground behind the officers. And he is purported to have said, "I'm not going to perform here just for the officers, I'm here to perform for the troops. And until this seating arrangement is rearranged and the troops are in front, I'm not going on stage." And there's an interesting photograph in my book with the officers of the camp seated on benches halfway back in the audience, and all the troops are seated on the ground right in front of the stage. And I'm of the belief that that was the incident that triggered that seating arrangement to put the officers in the back. I talk about a charming couple in my book, Phyllis and Tony Santamatos. And Phyllis, as a teenager, heard about some of the camp shows and lived just a few blocks away from the front entrance of Camp Anza. And she and her sisters would go to the main entrance and smile at the guard, and as often as not, they were allowed into the camp and to watch the stage shows at the outdoor theater. Interestingly, one of the former Italian POWs who was assigned to an Italian service unit met Phyllis at Camp Anza, I believe at one of these shows. And they ended up getting married and living in that same neighborhood after World War II. There are several instances of couples meeting and marrying at Camp Anza or soon after the war, having met while working at the camp. One is Fred and Louise Woodard. Fred was part of the station complement, and he was a handsome, dashing soldier. And Louise Woodard worked in the headquarters building, and Fred came in one day and she decided at first sight, that is the man I'm going to marry. And sure enough, they did get married at the camp chapel in 1943 and were married for nearly 65 years after that. Fred built a home just off the Camp Anza property after the war, raised a family there. He went on to become the fire chief of the city of Riverside in the 1970s. The home that he built for his family there actually had 3 windows in it from demolished buildings that were left over from Camp Anza during its time that it was demolished. One of the Italian service unit members, Federico Ferrari, was noted for his paintings that were done around the camp. And he met his wife Irene during the war, and they got married after the war. She went with a group of ladies to Italy to actually marry their husbands and bring them back to the United States. And Federico Ferrari, along with Tony and Phyllis Santamatos, were couples that returned to the United States, built a home, raised families and grandchildren back here in the United States. Federico Ferrari went on to become a vice president at the Pacific Outdoor Billboard Company. And during the 1960s, many of the billboards, huge billboards that were painted to do advertising around the city of Los Angeles, were actually painted by Federico Ferrari based on his wonderful painting talents. He was able to create almost photographic imagery on a very large scale, painting by hand. Having noticed Federico Ferrari's painting talent while he took time to paint portraits for many of the soldiers around the camp, Colonel James K. Herbert, who was in charge of the Los Angeles Port of Embarkation, saw his talent and actually commissioned Federico to paint a portrait of the colonel's son. That portrait hangs today in West Point at the General James K. Herbert Alumni Center at West Point. So his work was very highly regarded, and in addition to doing his portraits, the Army commissioned him to paint a Hawaiian theme tropical lounge in the Officers Club. It was quite ornate, and I have pictures of that in my book. In addition, he painted a very large Transportation Corps mural that also hung in the Officers Club. It was about 20 feet long and about 12 feet high, and it was quite dramatic representation of all the different facets of the transportation corps, shipping by rail, by truck, by sea, and by air. Italy surrendered during World War II in 1943, so they exited the war as combatants relatively early in the war. There were many POWs, Italian POWs, in both the United States and in England. Those that were housed in the United States, since they were no longer combatants against the United States, were given an option to remain in their POW camp, typically those were on the East Coast, or they could sign an oath of allegiance that they would no longer engage in any activities against the Allies. If they did so, they were formed into what were called Italian service units, and they were in effect made auxiliary parts of the United States military. So they were no longer POWs, they were actually issued military uniforms and assigned to various camps throughout the United States. In the case of Camp Anza, the Italian service unit that was formed was a quartermaster unit, and they worked in the laundry, they worked in the mess halls, and they worked as mechanics for the vehicles. They were allowed to leave camp since they were no longer combatants, sometimes in the company of an officer, an American military officer, but quite often they were allowed to leave the camp, again, since they had signed their oath, without military supervision. They were considered truly an auxiliary part of the United States military. The Italian service unit members and the POWs were all returned to Italy after the war. Even if they did later come back and start a family in the United States, they were returned home. That was a requirement. Other entertainers at Camp Anza included Art and Dottie Todd. They were a married couple, and Art was the director of entertainment for Camp Anza. The names may or may not be familiar to people, but in 1958, long after the war, they had a song entitled Chanson d'Amour that became number 8 on the charts in 1958. They performed throughout Camp Anza in various stage shows in the theaters and in the hospital complex. And they also performed with an African-American dancer by the name of Sammy Green, who was highly popular. So the entertainment programs that were done were often integrated at Camp Anza. In the Officers Club, there's a famous picture of Colonel Sarles, the commanding officer of Camp Anza, shaking hands or pointing at a picture actually with Bob Hope. So he hosted Bob Hope after the radio show that was done in March of 1945. In that photograph, Bob Hope and Colonel Sarles are in front of a rather risque Hawaiian maiden painting in the Tropical Lounge at the Officers Club in Camp Anza. The original paintings that were done appear to have been topless native maidens, but I believe for the sake of propriety, it's evident that some of the paintings had a lei placed strategically on the Hawaiian maiden to cover up any inappropriate parts that might have been showing. Camp Anza became a passion for me in recent years when I was able to learn a little bit about what was going on in the neighborhood of my youth. As I grew up in the Arlanza area, we used to find old abandoned buildings, foundations, and so forth. And we didn't understand their purpose. And in recent years, I came across on an internet search a matchbook cover, of all things, that said Camp Anza on it. And I had heard of March Field. In fact, I was born at March Air Force Base. And I had heard of Camp Hahn, but I had heard nothing about Camp Anza. When I did further research, I found out that there was a third military establishment in Riverside, and I further learned that it was the neighborhood that I grew up in as a child. So having seen the old buildings and not understanding the context that created them, it sent me on a mission to try and understand what was there, why it was there, how long it was there, put that story together and put it together in a way and share it so that the residents of the community would know the answers to all the questions I wish somebody had told me when I was growing up as a child there and found these old buildings. I believe that Camp Anza was forgotten for several reasons. One was its existence was very short. It was really in place for just a little over 4 years. The second phenomenon is that many military veterans, when you speak to their families, will comment on the fact that they didn't like talking about their experiences during World War II after the war. And so I think it was just something that was filed away. It was a very brief experience for nearly 750,000 soldiers that passed through the camp. They were there anywhere from 24 hours to 10 days. So in the context of a lifetime, that's a very brief period, and I think it was easily forgotten based on that short time frame that soldiers were there. Camp Anza actually processed a little less than 500,000 troops coming home from World War II. It was the first welcome home point for troops returning from the Pacific. The experience really began out as far as Catalina Island. As ships were coming into the port of Los Angeles bringing in returning troops, a blimp might appear overhead with loudspeakers playing the famous Dinah Shore song, "It's Been a Long, Long Time." It's kind of a welcome home, and it had great meaning to the troops. When they got off the ship, they immediately boarded a train and were brought into Camp Anza. Once at Camp Anza, they were given a ticket, if you will, for a steak dinner, and they were invited to have milkshakes, ice cream, and were shown their living quarters. One of the troops who came home really expressed his excitement at getting to sleep in a bed that had sheets and a pillow for the first time in months or years. So the welcome home at Camp Anza was actually their first taste of being back in America, and it was actually quite a moving experience for many of the troops.